hey, when we begin to say, hey, you haven't explained why, and I need a better why, well, that allows us to be able to have change and reform.
Well, howdy, friends. Welcome to the Roundup podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Tidwell. I have my co-host with me, Chase Abner. Chase, how is Ames, Iowa today, my friend?
It is sunny and unseasonably warm, man. It's been crazy here. Like temps in the 60s. It's unreal. Like
60s. We're high 70s today, so it's one of those things here in Texas that, like, man, I wish I could wear what I wear in the morning is what I want to wear in the afternoon, but Texas just will not allow it till February.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting a taste of the Texas weather. So this is
man.
one of my last responsibilities of the week. We're recording this on a Friday, and then on Sunday I get on a plane and head to you in Austin, Texas, Mitch.
Let's go, man. Hey, I'm excited about that. We're gonna spend 3 days talking about Roundup. By the way, Roundup's gonna be May 11th through 13th. We're gonna have that in DFW, so that's what we're playing in. Chase is coming in for, so yeah, don't want to miss it. But yeah, you'll get a taste of Austin. Have you been to Austin before?
It'll be my first time, man.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
we'll give you. You'll have a good experience while you're there. So we're at a really sweet spot. Good food. It's awesome. So
It's good.
Man.
Thank you.
Well, glad you're coming. In fact, talking about Texas, we got another Texan who is not currently in Texas. He is in Washington State. But Keith Wieser, how you doing, Keith?
Doing well. Glad to be here.
Man, glad you're here. Keith's the lead pastor of Resonate Church up in Washington State, out of Pullman, Washington. They've planted churches all over the Pacific Northwest. He is a native of Alvin, Texas, which
That's right.
If you're not aware, that's the home of Nolan Ryan. So that's where Keith comes from. If you're ever batting against him, man, don't charge them out. And guys from Alvin, they'll throw you in a headlock and put you in a bad place really quick. But
they teach all of us that.
That's what happens in the Alvin High School, man. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that probably sounds weird. Just look up Nolan Ryan, Alvin Ventura. Is it? No, Robin Ventura. Robin Ventura. So, anyways, classic. But Keith, glad to have you on, man. Tell us a little bit about yourself and just kind of a quick word on Resonate Church and what you guys do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like Mitch said, I'm from Texas, but have been up in the Northwest for 20 years now. And so we started in the Portland area, end up at Washington State University, and we're there doing collegiate ministry in a parachurch context, and really felt the Lord's leadership to pivot that towards a collegiate church. So that was in 2007. Didn't have a whole lot of models in that. So, basically trying to figure out what does this look like. And so over the last few years, just really sense that, man, this is this place that's pivotal for the kingdom of God, and to be able to see these leaders brought in and ultimately sent out. And so that's kind of our goal in planting collegiate churches. And so we have been pursuing that really specifically for the last 6-7 years. And so we have churches in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and it's been in Nevada. And so that's been a cool thing to get to see. And so we're excited to be able to continue to focus on the college campus and see what God does.
That's good. That's good. Hey, Keith, you and I are of a similar age. And so I'm really interested always in hearing your thoughts on leadership, and especially now as we're kind of moving into a different age cohort, and often college students now, like, I have more in common with their parents these days
Absolutely.
than I do with them, which is like, it's just a whole new thing. And so, we were together in August at a meeting at NAM headquarters, and I was really listening into a conversation, like a kid in a candy shop, getting to hear two really smart people discuss just challenges of leadership. And that's really what we want to do in this podcast, is just touch on some leadership concepts, ideas, struggles that you're just working through right now. Some of it's COVID related, some of it's generation related. But so yeah, that's love to hear you talk about that thing that I heard you talk about in August with the challenges of decisive leadership and how that's working in today's society. Maybe it's a generational thing, maybe it's a COVID thing. I don't know, but just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go back to just one of the premises you started with, and that is really the context of, you are as your leader, we're all in this place where we have this static, we are in an age group, and that's not changing. And yet, as you work with younger people, they stay the same. 18-year-olds are always 18-year-olds when they show up to the college campus. and that distance gets larger and larger. You take that thing that's happening with this cultural reality that really change is happening at an increasing rate, and really what that requires is a really adaptability from a leadership that really there's no one before us that can model that, because they've not had the speed of change that has happened. And so it's like, I think as a modern leader, you're having to figure out something that really you can't go back and look at and to be able to say, man, I'm gonna read a book on this, but really the pace of change right now is crazy. And so as we think about, hey, what is a skill that a leader has to have, and really the idea of being able to navigate that change and being able to figure out, hey, what worked here doesn't necessarily work there, and it's like unintuitive. We go back to the things that have worked in the past, and our assumption is that that's going to work in the future, in the present. And if that's not significantly analyzed and really being able to say, hey, does this model still work? Does this process still work? Does this leadership style still work? Oftentimes we find ourselves intentionally getting behind in terms of relevancy. And I've seen that over and over. And that's a pretty significant. So I think that's wise for you just to be able to highlight that innovation almost needs to be a skill set of the modern leader, and to be able to say, okay, if I don't consistently figure out how to process change, I'm inherently going to be swimming upstream in this. So one of the things that we really saw, this whole pandemic has really accelerated everything, and what was in the water just got accelerated. And, I've heard, every month of this is like a year in terms of how we've been able to see these shifts accelerate. And so, things like when we began when everything that was happening, the lockdowns happening, and everything's just radically changing for the church and for really the campus. And all of a sudden, these things that were geographic oriented were not geographically oriented, anymore. You couldn't gather all these things. We began to say, okay, what do we need to do? And immediately, my default was to go back to, okay, so we need to make quick decisions. So we created an executive leadership team, and that executive leadership team really was like, how do we, you heard the word pivot. How do we take and make decisions faster? And, how is it that we are decisive and clear, and all those things that I thought, hey, this is what we need. We need to be able to have clarity and decisiveness and speed. And so we did that. And, I thought, man, we absolutely nailed it. And in the process of that, all of a sudden we realized that it was like we were walking out ahead of everybody, and we were getting more and more distant. And as we got more and more distant, our voices lost impact. And so this idea that would like inherently, hey, this is what leaders do. I missed something. And in the process of that thing really happened, and it revealed, I think, something that is now becoming more and more clear. And that's really the sensitivity to authority. And so as we drew that circle smaller and we made more decisive leadership decisions, it really revealed to the next generation maybe a power distance. So it revealed that, hey, these are the group of people that are making decisions that are affecting all this group of people. And I think that sensitivity was something that is a part of Gen Z and a part of really this upcoming generation. And as we begin to see them really process, like, hey, I'm not sure if my needs were considered, and this is all over, every pastor had are my needs being considered in this. But it was really interesting because it wasn't necessarily about what the outcomes were for that. It wasn't, are we meeting or not, or how are we going to do this? It was almost like, hey, my voice wasn't included in this, and therefore that was a struggle. So I think that power dynamic was really revealed in that.
Yeah. And obviously I don't want you to talk outside of school too much, but is that a dynamic you experienced with the students you were leading, or with your staff team or both?
Well, our staff team skews pretty young.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so that, I think that that's still a generation. I mean, they're
Mm-hmm.
most of them are of a different generation than I am, as they're in their 20s. And so there's an extension of that. And so I heard leaders say, hey, we said this thing, and it felt like we lost the room. And that lost the room language was, that's really talking more of some sort of an emotional distance that was created from some sense of sensitivity to authority. And so that was one of those things that was really fascinating to watch. First it was staff, and then staff communicates, hey, this was also a part of what we saw from the student side. And so that idea of what's worked in the past seemed like it was a more challenging reality for our students to really be able to say, oh, absolutely, man, my leaders, I trust them. Thank goodness someone's thinking about this. That was a more difficult moment that we discovered.
And in responding to that, Keith, I think my default, and maybe too many leaders' default is, all right, how do I lead these people so they behave and react to my leadership the way that they used to, or the way that I want to? Like, how do I fix this
Totally.
about them, rather than how do I need to lead differently in light of this reality? So, what's that looking like for you? Like, what does, to use the word, what does pivot look like for you now in light of what you've experienced?
Yeah. So, Simon Sinek writes the book, was it Start with Why?
Start with why. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think that was one of those things that as he writes that, I was like, hey, that's what a good leader that is becoming better at leading should do. And now I think that that's the bottom line. Like, you can't, if you don't have why, it's not like you're flourishing to be able to do that. You're surviving in the next generation if you're not being able to really give clarity as to why. And part of that is that this idea that I should be considered, and that is kind of this normative thing where the idea that there's so much individualism in this, that people are seeing themselves not as like, hey, I bet they're doing what's good for the whole. We just see ourselves at, hey, what's good for me? And is someone like me a part of that decision? Is there someone that has my specific context in mind? Is that a part of those things? And so I feel like more and more we've had to say, hey, here's the why, not just the what. And really, if we can articulate those kind of things, and we can articulate how we arrived at the decision, and the way by which people were considered, and a diverse group of opinions were really considered. I think that idea of who is making the decision, is there diversity in the decision making, and then the why behind that. I think that those are the two things that I'm recognizing are essential at this point.
Keith, in these moments like COVID, these are like, I think two big moments that have happened in my life. You had 9/11 and COVID.
Yeah.
Like, those are, culture changing things. And so, COVID hits, there's kind of chaos, and like, what do we do? So you create a small team to make these quick decisions to make sure everyone's okay. And so it's like, how does it, part of it, I imagine, I just think about if I put myself in your shoes of like, it's just kind of that moment where you're like, man, guys, I just need you to trust us in this moment. This is a moment of kind of crisis. So like, I realize you have questions, but we have to move fairly quickly here to keep us in a good spot. And just this, probably the frustration over like, man, I really just need you to be on board with me. I don't know. I just try to think like, is that, and not that these moments come up a lot, but I'm like, man, I wonder what, like, and you mentioned this earlier, is like thinking more individual than as a whole. And so like, I don't know. I just think for and I'm really thinking out loud here. So if you're watching this, I don't have this solid thought right here, but I'm like struggling a little bit with like, how do you lead a group of people and make decisive decisions when there is that real hesitancy of that, of that lack of trust, and especially when you think about where you're at, where you have multiple churches, you have several layers of leadership, and there's probably even more like hesitancy because this is seen more, even though you guys are super lean and mean and, and how you do things, it feels more of like an organization, an institution a little bit because of how big it's getting. So I don't know. I just like, as I think like if I'm in Keith's shoes, like, man, how do I really handle that of continue to influencing the next generation when there is this real hesitancy? And in fact, like, I just think I would imagine there was a great amount of frustration of like, man, guys, just trust me on this one. Let us get through this season. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess how did you personally kind of walk through that, and especially being of a different generation, because you don't just want to say, hey, I want you guys to blindly follow me, but yet you do really want your people to trust you because that's where, the Lord has appointed you.
Yeah, no, that's just organizational trust is low. And so I think that we can say it shouldn't be and why, and, in some ways we just have to say, hey, this is what it is.
Yeah.
And we don't love it, but on one hand, it can be a very reforming thing. And there's a lot of really cool things with being able to say, hey, when we begin to say, hey, you haven't explained why, and I need a better why. Well, that allows us to be able to have change and reform. And those are some good things. And I think if if you're a leader of an organization, and it's likely right now that you have more criticism than you've ever had before, it's likely that there's more distrust than ever before. And, you have the opportunity I have the opportunity to personalize that. And I worked through that many times with Jesus, right? Like, man, this sucks. Why am I just don't want to be in this place. Why is there this much criticism? But the other side of that is really being able to say, okay, how is it that there's a new trust building paradigm that we begin to like, can the church lead out in that? And that can that in terms, affect businesses and families. And so I think part of that, that I try to figure out how is the amount of information is connected to the amount of relationship that I have. So if I'm in a place where I'm having to make decisions and I'm communicating those kind of things, how is it that I'm putting that into places where I have high relationship? So let me say like this, like where I used to maybe speak to our entire church and be able to say, this is what I begin to say, okay, that's not what needs to happen. And so at the very beginning, we were putting out to our entire church, hey, here's what we're doing with COVID stuff. But then what happens is we pivoted to be able to say, we're going to put that into a discipleship process where I'm going to talk to the people that are my direct reports, but I'm not going to speak to anyone else outside of that. And then they're going to carry that down the discipleship chain. And that really began to change how we begin to move forward. And so the idea of the discipleship tree is the language we used to be able to say, hey, this is who you're responsible for. And, in part, what that began to do is two things. One, it began to build a higher level of trust. And then it began to solidify, hey, these are the people who I'm responsible for. This is my discipleship thing. And I began to realize maybe that's what Jesus was intending to do. We built the mega church where there's one voice to everybody. And then we kind of begin to bypass there's not the necessity for people to take individual discipleship responsibility. But in this moment, we had to say, okay, you have to take responsibility because Keith's voice is not going to land very well in this context, or the site pastor's voice. So you need to be able to take. So those are some of the things that we've been trying to figure out in terms of being able to say, let's put anything like this into the highest level of relationship that we can do.
Yeah, I like how you situate that. Maybe this is what Jesus always intended, and that the person with the greatest voice in the disciples' life is the person who's walked with them the most closely, and not not that you're a disembodied leader, but to some people in the Resonate church family, like they don't see you in person very often, right? They're in Nevada or they're wherever, and so
Yeah,
There's relational distance, there's geographic distance, there's now a generational difference, and so
absolutely.
you've got 3 layers at least at work for you in your church model that maybe other people aren't facing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and let me just go off just a little bit tangentially in that our model has been to try to create, typically efficiency around a singular voice, and ultimately there's almost a brand that happens with a talent, or and so I think that there's obviously God has gifted some individuals in incredible ways with that. As I look to the future, I don't see that as a well, let me not necessarily viability. I don't see that accelerating as a model. I see that there's smaller groups, and part of that's the social anxiety that we're seeing bubble up, and I don't know if that's going to go away. So especially in in-person kind of context. So we can talk about digital kind of separately, but the size I think is going to be smaller, and I think part of that is going to be the tribalism that we see everywhere else is going to be just a part of how people understand, hey, my social group, people that I trust, that's who has authority. And maybe that's always been there to some degree, but now I think that's really tightening, that there's a smaller group of people that have any kind of speak in. And so I think that what we have to do is pivot from the idea of big groups where we can kind of have authority in those big groups to being able to have like diffused, decentralized, really ways by which we have influence.
Mm-hmm.
And I get excited about that because that seems more like movement, and this idea that there's so many more people that can be influential in smaller groups. And we don't have to wait for the uber talented individual to be able to have this kind of impact on college campuses and churches and stuff like that. So that's been a fascinating thing to kind of watch really across the nation as I talk to people. Hey, it seems like there's smaller groups that are happening, and there's a preference towards that from the student point of view.
Yeah. And to be clear, Keith, that was not I wasn't lobbing a critique at your model. I was just
Oh, no.
I was just noticing, something that would be a unique challenge in the way. But it's true in any network, and I see it, in the church that I'm a part of and others where the assumption has been, well, people want to be a part of something. If it looks like it was cool over there, it would be cool to be a part of that here. But I don't know if that's sustainable, and I don't know if that's going to continue to be a thing as the individualism is being embraced more and more. And I don't know. I don't know if you guys have seen that happening, or if that's in the same realm. I'm thinking, Salt Network or Resonate or whatever. It's like the people who've experienced it in one place are excited about it, but um, I'm just thinking about the next generation, and like I would actually rather have my own thing and with its own name that's more unique to where we are, that isn't connected to
Mm-hmm.
something that started in a different generation now.
Mm-hmm.
So
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah, that sense of ownership is pretty high, and that sense, everything in the world now is customizable, and it is, everything that used to be the case is, we used to get bundles of things, and now the world has unbundled that. So you used to buy a CD, right? Now you get a track, you listen to something,
you don't
and
get the track, you stream it. It's
right,
yeah,
totally. And so those things that were like, oh, this is how it has to be, that's being challenged on every level. And
yeah,
so I think that same person who comes into your world of, church or ministry, they're asking those same questions, that are ultimately consumeristic questions. And so,
Yeah.
there's some part of that that has a negativity about it, right? So this is meant to serve me, is not a Christian thought. And yet, as we think about the discipleship process, where do we start with that? And so it's very difficult to start with something that has that kind of diversity to it. So yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting thing as people begin to figure out really what draws them into that. And Uh, and so, the good thing about that is you can leverage some of those implicit cultural values for a kingdom purpose to be able to say, okay, now you're empowered to go start something, and we want to give you guardrails to it. We want to give you places to have an alignment to it, but there's some pretty big opportunities for people to say, man, we can create more things.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, the gospel is the thing that has to drop into the person before any of that can happen. It's Saul Rexius uses the phrase often, "You matter, but you're not the point." In a way,
Mm,
like, hey, that
yeah.
dignifies, that validates the unique person that's sitting there in your church or in your community. Um, but that doesn't mean that your preference or whatever is ultimate. And if they don't have the gospel as like, hey, I've been purchased into this family, and secondarily, like, I'm unique, but I don't even make great decisions for myself. Like, I don't even know what's best for myself. Uh,
Yeah.
so, so approaching that, that I think is one of the challenges going forward with discipling the next generation, is navigating that tension. So I don't know if I had a great point there, but just an observation.
Keep.
Good.
Well, I was asking, I always feel like, as your, Resonate Church, I'm always really compelled by y'all's vision, your mission of what you guys are doing. And I imagine just being a student, I think like, man, I would love to get in, involved in something that's, that's bigger than myself. And I wonder if like there's a change now. I'm a, kind of a mid millennial, but like with Generation Z, is that really compelling, for them? Is like that kind of vision of like, being a part of like Resonate, something that's bigger than yourself, of doing something that's, without the Lord, it's like, it can't be accomplished. But like for the next generation, I'm wondering if do you have to cast a, almost feels like you got to cast a more individualized vision for them rather
Yep.
than this big thing. So like I even wonder like how do you compel them, in the ministry that you're doing? Does that change, with this next generation coming up?
Yeah. No, that's 100% right.
Mm.
So we've used those, I can't remember what, if this is somebody wrote, like, talking about getting on a bus, and it's like we're all going on a
Mm.
bus together, and that whole thing where at some point there's a driver and you're in a seat, and
Mm.
that kind of thing. For many reasons, I think that idea is not compelling. So I think about, a few years ago, I did a long bike ride from Seattle to Portland, and the thing that allowed us to survive is being a thing called a Peloton, where you're right on the back tire of someone behind you, and you gain like 30% more efficiency being able to be that. And I feel like that's the new kind of thing, like where you're doing your thing, you're aligned, you're doing
Mm.
something together, you're in a destination, but you're pedaling, you're
Yeah.
engaged. This
Mm-hmm.
is the reality. So we've pivoted. So we, planting 21 churches by the year 2021 was the vision. Really began, and it was a millennial oriented vision. Hey, this is what we're all doing together. But inherently, it was a corporate, or it was an organizational
Mm-hmm.
kind of idea. And the pivot in the future is, how is God going to use you specifically? How can
Mm.
we help you to be able to start something, to be able
Mm.
to take and be a missionary where you're at?
Mm.
And so that's that more individual thing. And then we can celebrate our impact all together,
Mm.
but it's really oriented more towards, how is it that we create systems that accelerate the student, and that's what they lean into.
Yeah. It's like you're not, hey, we're not all getting on a bus together. We're carpooling. You're going to go there in your own unique way. We're going to the
Yeah.
same destination. And, I think, as I think the way that can be leveraged, obviously, high individualism, consumer, we want people to see they're a part of the body of Christ. But like on the other hand, it's like if someone sees himself as unique, then they see, okay, well then I have a unique ministry. So I just imagine, if all that could, if all that could be used for good, then what you do is you'd have multiple expressions of of Jesus in all these different places that
Yeah.
aren't in the same spot. I just
Mhm.
imagine the reach can be that much bigger based on kind of how this next generation is shaped. So, anyways, just a thought.
And for churches
One of the
that
things I think we're going to have to do is I think that there's a lot more fragility in Gen
Yeah.
Z. There's a lot more need for us to be able to remind them they can do these things, to be able to help create scenarios where they have a lot of support and a lot of affirmation. And that's what they've experienced most of their life. And they expect that from their church leaders as well. And
Yeah.
so the going back into some like, hey, like military ideas of, hey, we're gonna build you up and then send you out, that's going to be a difficult thing. And I think that for a college context, post college care is the thing that we're putting so much more focus on at this point.
Really?
Because that feels like hey, when I really needed my church, they stopped this process when I graduated. And the cool thing about the pandemic is it allowed that digital reality of connection to be able to be proven. And we still need to figure out what that looks like in a healthy way. But we just saw how geographic proximity wasn't as significant as we thought it was.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Mitch, you're talking about the individual and their calling, and they're getting to the same place, just going in a different vehicle or whatever. Just thinking that for churches that still have a gathered service with, sound and lights or whatever, I'm hoping some of those people feel like their personal calling is to roll cables and to and to set up chairs. That and they find nobility and glory in a proper context, in playing that part. So,
totally.
but I think that's the challenge, anytime when you exalt the individual, that it doesn't keep them from seeing service as honorable, as noble, and denying oneself for the sake of others.
Yeah, I mean, there's the tension of the Ephesians 2:10, where it's workmanship, creating Christ Jesus for good works. There's this unique. I mean, Will Mancini's built an entire ministry off of, a big part of his ministry off of that, which I wholeheartedly, believe in. But yet, there's the aspect of being a part of the body, and we serve the body, we're under the body, we serve each other, we serve the world. And so it's like, how does your it's like your uniqueness is involved in community. You're not just like this lone ranger missionary out there. And so how to get those students on board with that, which Keith would know better than I would on that. But I just feel like that's a challenge that's coming up.
Yeah. What does it look like to outdo, to use the biblical command to outdo one another in showing honor, in this world and in the generation that's to come? I don't know. I don't have answers, but
yeah, we talked about this, before we got on, but I even wonder, when you have, I just think about, myself when I was, 20s, if I have a supervisor, if I have someone in spiritual authority, I just basically said yes. I just did whatever they wanted. I just kind of trusted them until they gave me a reason not to trust them. But I feel like, right now, Gen Z, it's almost like you got to prove that before there's a yes on the table. And as Chase, you even mentioned that yes is pretty thin. That trust is pretty thin. It can be broken pretty quickly. And so, and I think that even connects with what Keith was saying earlier. Just there's a lot of fragility when it comes to leading the next generation and their buy-in and even their emotional state, their anxiousness, and all those things. There's just so much. I think there was less amount 10 years ago. There was less amount of probably holistic care to the person, and a more focus on mission. And so now I think the pendulum's kind of swinging where as Keith, you even mentioned, during COVID, it was almost kind of like, whoa, hold on, we want to stay still, before we go charging the hill. We want to make sure that we're being, cared for, thought of, like all those kind of things. So, there's good in there and there's challenges, but, I just wonder what, as you said, I think as leadership, there has to be a transition in the way that we're, uncasting vision, then motivating them and building trust with them as well.
Yeah. I think the previous generation, like the default to trust the authority, was somewhat undone by the advent of the internet and access to information. Because I mean, possession of the information in some ways is what created the power dynamic, or it created the authority in the past. And so, Mitch, you're a few years younger than me, so you're talking about the big events of your life being COVID and 9/11, and for me, it'd be hard not to include the birth of the internet if I think about the major changes that happened, in my lifetime as a 40-year-old. I remember having a conversation once with my oldest son. He was like 5 at the time, and he always had questions about animals, like, can this animal do this, or what does this like. And obviously, I did not know the answers often, and so
if I can't sleep at night, I Google the same thing.
So he said he asked me some question. So he asked me the question. I don't even remember what the question was, but I said I don't know. He said, well, you could look it up. I said, what do you mean? He's like, you could look it up on the internet. I said, well, what's the internet? He says, it's on your phone. And so, like, in that moment, I'm realizing, like, in a generation, so from me to my son, when I was his age, the internet functionally did not exist for the average, like for the common person. Like maybe some military people had it or knew what it was. To like, from that generation, from me to him, when he was 5 years old, it went from not only not existing to existing in everybody's pocket, And so you could learn about anything, like, and when it comes to church and ministry, like, it's like we're unconsciously competent in the sense, like, we don't know, or like we don't know how much access we have to information. It's just like we're wet fish, like it's just there, and we swim in it all the time. And so we subconsciously know, and the next generation knows this even more stronger than us, that they could become the expert that we are in anything if they just had the time and the internet connection, right? Like they can read seminary level, they can read dissertations, they can listen to sermons and lectures from all over the world. They can, look up on Wikipedia or whatever, archaeological information about Bible time, like all that information is there. And so it's just not impressive, and it doesn't create or lend itself to authority anymore. So it's just changing, that changing so much. And because of that, like, again, the longer ramp to them following leadership is because they know that, and they don't need to know what information you have. They need to know that it's actually changed you, and that you care. And so,
that's a good word.
Yeah,
that's a good word.
Yeah. But then it's thin, man. Like I pity like people who are public communicators, on a weekly basis, because the use of a wrong pronoun, could undo everything for some people. And I don't mean that like to be crass or to be unsensitive. I'm just saying, like, that's really where we're at. And so it's challenging times, but there's good, right? There's good opportunities here.
Hey,
that's so good.
Keith, last question here for you, unless Chase, if you got something else you want to ask. If you're what advice would you give a college minister or lead pastor out there that's really heavily involved with next generation, as far as thinking about their leadership in terms of like, hey, maybe there's some things about me that need to change. Maybe there's some ways that I'm leading that need to change. What advice would you give wisdom to someone like that as they're thinking about, like, I just don't think the way that I lead is going to work here. Like, what about me? What do I need to do to change or think about? What advice would you give?
Yeah. Hey, I think that obviously whenever we could get feedback from the people that we lead, that's probably for all of us the most significant thing that would allow us, in all kind of diversity of personalities, to be able to say, hey, here's how this is landing. And I think that it's harder and harder for us to figure out, with the diversity out there, like what is that actually, what's that experience on the other side of me? And I think that's the question that I've begun to ask more and more, is what are people experiencing, and is that my intent? And so that would be one of those things, just making sure that, that's such a huge trust building thing whenever you say, hey, tell me, give me some feedback on this. One of the things that I felt like leaders need to just a couple of resources that I felt like have been really helpful. And some of this is oriented around like family systems theory, but there's a book called Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman. And it was actually written in the 90s. And yet I read it and I was like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what is going on in terms of leadership. And a guy named Steve Cuss and he's a pastor in Colorado, and kind of made some of those ideas into a more tangible format and in a book called Managing Leadership Anxiety. But he just talks about really what does it look like to be differentiated as a leader and to also be present as a leader, like to be able to have the sense of like, I'm not going to be sucked into your chaos, some differentiation, but I'm not going to be aloof into the emotional state. And just, the recognition is that they want more empathy than competency from you. Like that's the working thing now is the level of your empathy. And so whenever you can do that and it doesn't violate, what you're trying to achieve, we don't want to just be oriented around, hey, empathy is the greatest thing here. We're still trying to impact the kingdom of God. And yet being able to figure out how can I really manage that as a leader. So those are some things I would say, hey, if you put your eye to that might be a helpful reality as you go forward.
That's really good.
Yeah, I feel like we've shared a lot of challenges in this conversation, and just to leave us maybe on a hopeful note, Mitch, especially thinking about the individualism and the rise of the individual in American society and even of late, that for me, and this, you hear me say this, that I think discipleship is helping people become who Jesus wants them to be. And so there is an opportunity where they're driven to be Jesus if he was in their person, like that they want that. They want those who've been born again. They do want that. And that's actually a really important thing for us to leverage and embrace and not to be put off by. It makes some of our go-to leadership moves a little less effective in this day and age, but if we keep the proper perspective, and if the Lord blesses, like we could see a whole new movement of God as people actually stop just trying to pretend to be the Christian that somebody else is and be the Christian that Jesus wants them to be, and they're going to take the gospel and carry his aroma into places that you or I wouldn't go. And so I'm encouraged by that.
Yeah.
It's a good word, man. Well, Keith, thanks so much, man. Appreciate you being on with us, and man, what a great conversation. We look forward to having you on again. There's a lot of different roadways we could go down here, and but man, appreciate you. Thanks for being involved in Sin Summit and all you've contributed to leaders here in Texas, and not just Texas but beyond. So thank you.
We love it, man. It's such a privilege being with you guys. Thanks.
No, you got it. All right, man. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Well, friends, thanks for joining us on the Roundup podcast today. I hope you enjoyed our show with Keith Wieser. Please stay tuned to all of our new episodes. You can subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. We have a YouTube channel now, so we put all of these podcasts on video there. And you can also follow us on social media. That's where we'll put them out at SBTC Collegiate. That'll be on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So, friends, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.